Welcome to the Mini Chameleon Podcast with Dr. Michael Nash. Today we're going to be talking about lighting. Oh, lighting may seem simple, but when you start putting all those lights on a mini enclosure, heat starts to become a problem. And so let's listen in as Dr. Nash talks about how he handles lighting mini chameleons.
Next up, we can talk a bit about light and heating. Of course, light is essential for chameleon keeping. I think everyone knows that. UVB is also very important for chameleon keeping, as is natural daytime light, as well as infrared light, which is what gives us heat, or one of the ways we get heat. So there's a lot to discuss here, but in short, indeed, tiny chameleons require UV like larger chameleons do. Their enclosures also require some form of natural daytime lighting. This might be offered by a 6500K bulb, something like that, potentially plant LED grow lights, although I try to avoid those purple colored ones. They just don't look that good. There's some concern it might hurt their eyes as well. In addition to that, depending on what you're trying to replicate in the species you're keeping, one can add heat lamps. However, for many of these smaller enclosures and smaller chameleons, I find that the heat put off by a dual T5 fixture is enough. So the heat coming off of, let's say, a 6500K grow light and a UVB light in the same fixture is often enough to create a bit of a heat gradient. Now, something very important about this in UV, a study I did, as well as some work other folks have done, Jonathan Hill and so on, has evaluated whether we need UV3, UV index 3 that is, or higher for raising these tiny chameleons. And what I found with a species, first for lateralis, carpet chameleons, that are quite small as babies, is that higher UV levels of 7 compared to 3 actually seems to slow down their growth. There's a lot of reasons why this might be, but all this is to say, more UVB is not necessarily better, and especially when you're keeping such tiny animals, it has the potential to be very dangerous. So UVB can cause free radical damage, it can cause cellular abnormalities, it can cause a lot of problems. In addition to that, with the setup I'm describing with a dual bulb fixture on top, we have heat and UV coming from the same source. That's more or less consistent with what we see outside, but in our setups, one needs to be pretty careful because if the chameleon gets too close or has too much exposure to the heat, that also might mean that they're getting too much exposure to UV since it's effectively the same source. Now, adding a separate heat bulb is certainly possible and that mitigates this issue, but of course you want to be careful to not overheat the enclosure. So we know then that too high of UV levels can actually slow growth of tiny chameleons. I've actually had circumstances where very, very tiny species, as babies, which are even smaller, have physically climbed on the screen directly under what I thought was an otherwise mild dual fixture with a T5 UVB bulb as well as a 6500K other sort of ambient light bulb. It's not very warm, but when you're a very, very tiny creature climbing directly underneath it, I actually had a couple of them die simply from exposure to that high level of UV and heat. To us and to large chameleons, it's perhaps not very much, but for something so small, again, these smallish appearing risks can be a big deal. So how do you fix this? Well, you simply don't allow them to climb under the screen if possible. That's another benefit of using hybrid enclosures. The sides are smooth, they're slippery, so chameleons can't simply walk all the way up to the side and then under the light. If you keep the branches low enough, then it should be very hard for the chameleon to actually access the screen. So that's one thing, one very important strategy, limit their access to the screen in order to prevent possible damage. Again, this doesn't mean that in the wild, these chameleons can't withstand any temperature of 80 degrees, let's say, or it's impossible for them to tolerate a UV index of 4. It's just that the tools we have available to us are somewhat harsh, and as such, when we're keeping them in these somewhat confined spaces, we need to be very careful and cognizant to not overexpose them. Now, just a bit of science I'll talk about here. Again, we often think that higher UV levels are good, but with some studies recently sent out, indeed, it appears that too much UV, especially for tiny chameleons, is a bad thing. Now, interestingly, in the wild, this great paper compared what is the average amount of UV exposure for a tiny Kaluma, I think it was Kaluma nizudum, versus some larger species. I think they used Kaluma brevicorn. I'd need to check on all the specifics, but what they found was striking. They found that the overall average UV exposure of Kaluma nizudum, a very tiny Kaluma, was less than 1. The UV index was less than 1, averaged out over the course of when it chose to seek UV. I think it was around 0.3 or 0.4 average. So although UV is important, there's more and more evidence that especially for these tiny chameleons or chameleons at small stages of their life don't require quite as much as we would expect. Especially when we're using these smaller, shorter enclosures, I often will use older UV bulbs in order to obtain the correct amount of UV exposure. Correct is hard to define, but I define it as something that allows for successful reproduction, long-term care of chameleons without having them hide very much and without possibly increasing damage or increasing heat from the UV bulb exposure. A strategy one can use for heating also involves simply positioning these enclosures at different regions of the rack. Naturally, heat rises. Furthermore, if enclosures are kept on racks sort of on top of one another, then the heat that's emitted from the bulb beneath them, even if it's a UV or daylight bulb, will rise, warm the substrate, warm the rest of the enclosure. So depending on what season you're replicating, assuming you have a rack of small enclosures, you can simply position certain enclosures at different levels on the rack in order to help replicate whatever you're trying to do. Of course, going higher tends to be warmer, going lower tends to be cooler. Of course, one needs to consider if AC is coming from the top, things might be a bit different, but that's the general principle one can use. So heat lamps are usable, but again, with hybrid enclosures, it's often not necessary to use one, and plus there's the potential of overheating the enclosure, which can be very, very deadly. If one wants to use a heating source, I'd recommend a very small, low to the ground, or rather low profile halogen puck light. These are low wattage, maybe 20-25 watts, and you can turn them on and off intermittently. Typically, those work well for this purpose if you're really in need of increasing the heat. Otherwise, I'd recommend using a dual fixture, a T5, a UV bulb, and perhaps a 6500K or otherwise daylight bulb as well. Putting it on top of a relatively small enclosure tends to heat things appropriately, keep it roughly within the range of what we'd like. And of course, we can tweak that as needed. One other small thing I'll say that I hope no one goes overboard with, but it's an interesting tool that is available to people who use hybrid enclosures. It's simple heat pads. Now, there's a lot of caveats to using heat pads. Of course, they're notorious for breaking or malfunctioning sometimes, and you certainly don't want that. That can be truly deadly. But because the enclosure sides for a hybrid enclosure are solid, one can actually use heat pads. And if you simply affix it to the side, oftentimes that's a very effective method of gently raising the ambient temperature. This can be helpful when you're trying to stimulate a certain season, or replicate a certain season, rather. Now, with that said, chameleons seem to be mostly light-oriented organisms, so we're not totally certain if they're able to really interact with or understand what heating from the side of the enclosure really means. So you might not see them basking near it or interacting with it in ways you'd expect. Thus, you have to be very careful about how much heat you're adding with the pad and whether that's achieving the goals you need. So just another tool I thought I'd throw out there that has been helpful for some cases. I'd say overall for these tiny species, UV levels should be maybe 3 at the highest, and actually can be lower throughout the rest of the enclosure. With enough plants, they should be able to hide very well, but based on the evidence we have right now, higher than 3 does not appear to be helpful for speed of growth, probably not reproduction either, although that's sort of my own speculation, and thus high levels of UV are not essential. Just keep it relatively mild, and based on the data we have, that should be sufficient. For my own personal experience, UV level 3 max is perfectly fine for all of the tiny chameleon species I work with. One other thing to mention is that you should not be afraid to add extra bulbs if it's for the purpose of growing plants. Just be wary that even a small T5 high efficiency bulb can increase the temperature further. And it might not only increase temperature in the enclosure, but again, if it's on a rack system, it might increase the temperature slightly for all of the enclosures above it. So just keep that in mind, but plants are very important for these enclosures. If more lighting is needed to allow them to grow, I certainly recommend doing so.
Thank you very much for joining me and Dr. Nash here and talking about lighting mini chameleons. I hope this is giving you extra insight into chameleon husbandry, chameleons of all sizes. And we can ponder that until we come back next week for the next episode of Mini Chameleon Podcast with Dr. Michael Nash. Take care.